Welcome, and in this lesson, we're going to take a look at IAM policies, which allow us to grant permissions to specific AWS APIs, events, and actions. So, for example, everything inside of AWS is an API. Whenever we use the console, it's an API. Well, what I can do is we can create groups. We can have a developer group. We could have a finance group. We can have administrator groups. And we can apply permissions to a group, and any user that belongs to the group will receive those applied policies to the group. Now, a few key things that we're going to talk about and show in depth here, but I just want to get those drilled into your head real quick. A user can have multiple policies apply to the user's access policy. So if the user belongs to multiple groups, those access policies for the groups will all make up that user's policy. Now, one thing to know is that whenever you create a new user, by default, that user has deny permissions. That user has no access to anything inside of Amazon Web Services. You have to specifically allow access to the services or events or API actions that you want that user to have access to. One other key component is that if you then explicitly deny, which means you create a deny permission within the access policy, it will override any allow. So an explicit deny always overrides an allow. So let's just get started. I'm going to go ahead and go into my identity and access management console. We're going to go ahead and open up a second browser in 1 second, but I'm going to first go to users. And we're going to create a new user. I'm going to call this developer. This is the developer user, and we'll select create. And then we'll go ahead and close the window. We'll click on our developer user. Let's give our developer user a password, and we'll select manage password. I'll just assign a very simple custom password that conforms to my current password policy. And then let's open up another browser and log in. So this user was developer, and I'm going to log in as this user. Now, if I jump back over to my administrative where we created the user, we see that this user does not have any policies associated with it. So if I were to attempt to open up Amazon EC2, I'm going to get that I don't have permissions because by default, there are no permissions for this user. So currently, this user has no access. So if I were to attach it to a group, and if we recall, we had admins. The admins group was the power user group. Power users don't have the ability to manage IAM users. However, they do have the ability to do absolutely everything else within AWS. They have essentially administrative access except not to IAM. So anything that we wanted to do, any API action or event would work properly. However, if we were to then go and attempt to open up our IAM, we're not going to have permissions to do anything. So how can I attach a policy to this specific user, right? This specific user, I want to have access to be able to do IAM. Now, of course, what I would probably do is I would remove them from the admins group and just give them access to my group, which had the administrative policy associated to it. However, to demonstrate that you can have multiple policies on a specific user and that a user can belong to multiple groups, we're actually going to add a user to another group. The only group that's left that the user doesn't belong to is my group. So we'll select add to my groups. So now the user has permissions for both admin and my group. So if we head back over and hit refresh, we're now going to be able to administrate IAM. So let's talk a little bit about an explicit deny. This user has two sets of permissions. This user has administrative permissions and regular power user permissions. So can I override these permissions and actually completely deny access to everything on AWS? And the answer to that question is yes. So if I go to my groups and I open up admins, I want to take a look at my policy. I'm going to go ahead and copy this because we're going to create our deny all policy. Because an explicit deny always overrides an allow. And if we look at this, we are allowing everything but IAM for power user access. If we look at my group, which is administrative, we are allowing access to everything. So let's copy this one. So then let's head over to our policies and let's create our own custom policy. So we're going to create our own policy. Now, we could use the policy generator if we wanted, or we can create our own policy. And since I've already copied and pasted what I wanted to do, I'm just going to create our own policy. And I'm going to set this to deny. So this is going to deny all actions on all AWS resources. So I'm going to call this a deny all. And then we will create the policy. Make sure we have a capital D for deny and then create policy. It is case sensitive on that, so we put in the capital. And then so now if we head back over to our users and I go to my developer user and I say this individual user, I need to temporarily revoke access. Well, I could of course remove from group. But what I want to demonstrate is that an explicit deny overrides an explicit allow. So if we attach a new policy and we search for our custom deny all policy that we just created and attach the policy, we'll go back over to our console that our user has, and we'll go into EC2. And we could have done it in IAM, but essentially we don't have access to anything. Even though the user belongs to the groups that have power user access and administrative user access, there is a deny all policy, regardless of where that deny all is. That deny on a specific action could be in the admin policy. But a deny in any policy that a user is a member of will always override and allow. So let's go ahead and change this policy a little bit. I'm going to go over to policies. I'm going to open up my deny all policy by clicking on it. Well, let's take a look at what we see here. First, we see our Amazon resource name. We see our current policy document. We see the users or entities that are using this policy. That could be a group, it could be a role, it could be a user. Currently, this is a user. Then we have policy versions. Well, this is really cool because we can see the different versions of our policy. If we make a change that causes an error that we did not intend, we can roll back to a previous version. We can also see if the policy's been updated. Right, so let's go ahead and modify this. What I want to do is I want to say that this individual user needs administrative access. This individual user needs power user access. Now, again, in a production environment, chances are he wouldn't be a member of both groups. He'd probably be a member of just administrator, but we're demonstrating that you can be a member of multiple groups and have multiple policies. However, this user has proven that he indiscriminately will just terminate EC2 instances. Just for some reason, he accidentally deletes it. He has a AWS command line interface call somewhere. So we want to say this person doesn't need to terminate instances. They need access to everything else. They don't need to terminate instances. So we're going to create an explicit deny on just the terminate instances action. So that would be our EC2. We got to click edit. We'll change this to EC2, terminate instances. And this is the action we're going to deny. Now, I'm going to show you how we can generate custom policies. I'm also going to show you how we can validate and simulate policies. So let's go ahead and validate our policy here. It says, all right, this policy is good, so we'll go ahead and click save. So what I want to encourage you is that we're not creating a lesson here on mastering access policies. There's a lot to it, and you don't necessarily have to know how to master them for the CSA. We're learning how they work. So if we browse down, we see that the current version that we're using, which is set as default, is the one that prevents this user from having terminate instances. I could switch back over to version 1 by setting it as default. But of course we want our version 2 that we just created, so I'll set it back. So then if we head back over to our users, we go to our developer, we see that he has administrative access, power user access, and he has this deny all policy, which shows that the user does not have access to terminate instances. So if we open up EC2 again, we should have access to these instances. All right, well, we have access to instances. Let's very quickly just breeze through launching an instance. I'm just going to leave all of the defaults and select review and launch, then launch. We're not going to connect to this instance. We're actually just going to attempt to delete it. So now that this is running, I was able to start it with my developer user. That user has access because he has the allow on all AWS services. So instead, I'm just going to go ahead and go to instance state, terminate, and attempt to terminate this. Well, when I attempt to terminate this, I don't have access to perform this operation. That's because we have the explicit deny for just the EC2 terminate instances. If we were to remove the policy, it would allow us to terminate the instance. So let's click on Simulate Policy here real quick. Simulate Policy allows us to test just this policy document, right? So if I wanted to say, all right, let's test EC2, and I want to test to make sure the user can't terminate instances, and maybe we'll throw in a couple arbitrary ones in there. What we can do is we can then run simulation, and it'll say, all right, well, the user can't do it based off this policy, but everything else is allowed. Now, one thing to know is that this is just testing what this policy does. By default, users have deny all on everything unless you give them allow permissions. This policy document is just looking for the explicit declarations. If we were to create an allow here and then deny all for everything else, we would have allow here and denied for everything else. So this is just testing explicitly what the document says. So let's go ahead and finish up by removing the attached user policy on our specific user by selecting detach policy, and then we'll select detach. And then if we come back over to our other browser and go ahead and click on yes, terminate again, it will allow it because we now have permissions. So in this lesson, we learned that a user can belong to multiple groups, and those multiple groups policies apply together to make up that user's access policy. If there is an explicit deny in any of the policies associated with the user, then it will deny that access regardless if that user's been allowed in another group. An explicit deny always overrides an explicit allow. We also learned how to work with version controlling inside of our IAM policies, and we learned how to simulate IAM policies. So that concludes it for this lesson. Go ahead and complete this lesson and move on.